All right, so yesterday I made a video explaining how President Joe Biden was essentially planning on trying to cozy up to the Saudis and repair some of our relationships with them in an effort to basically get them to release some of their oil reserves to tamp down the skyrocketing prices that we have seen in the last couple of weeks. And I got a pretty big update here for you guys because apparently, at least according to The Guardian here, it did not go well. Okay, so they say Saudi Arabia and UAE leaders decline calls with Biden amid fears of oil price spikes. So let's just go ahead and jump into some of the details here. They say the de facto leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have declined to arrange calls with U.S. President Joe Biden in recent weeks as the U.S. and its allies have sought to contain a surge in energy prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I pretty much disagree that the spike in energy prices has been purely due to the invasion. That's obviously a major component of it, but I'm going to explain to you guys here in a second why corporate profiteering and essentially capitalism is actually the main driver of the rise in specifically gas prices that we've seen recently. But they continue saying, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing Middle East and U.S. officials, both Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE's Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed have been unavailable to Biden after U.S. requests were made for discussions, so just straight up ignoring his calls, I guess. And they also say that last week, OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, declined to increase oil production despite Western entreaties. So you see what they're doing. I mean, Russia, Saudi Arabia, other major oil producers, they are colluding with each other in order to keep the price of oil artificially high. It's not as if there's like some global, oil shortage or actual shortage of natural gas supplies. Even just here domestically in the United States, we export our oil, we export natural gas. Okay, so it's not a supply side shortage necessarily, but they're basically, again, keeping these prices artificially inflated so that they can make a fuck ton of oil by the current situation that's unfolding. So they continue saying, but reports of frigid communications with Saudi Arabia come as the Biden administration seeks to increase oil supply after formally banning Russian oil imports on Tuesday, pushing oil prices to $130 per barrel, the highest level in 14 years. And they say, however, and this is where we come into the Venezuela and Iran portion of this, they say the U.S. has for the first time in years opened up a diplomatic channel with Venezuela, a Russian ally which has the world's largest oil reserves. And they say Venezuela has now released at least 2 Americans from jail in an apparent goodwill gesture towards the Biden administration and a possible prelude to increasing production to ease the price surge. And listen, I mean, how realistic is it that we're going to be able to work with Nicolas Maduro? I mean, after all of the literal coup attempts that we have waged against Venezuela, the sanctions that have completely imploded their economy, that kill tens of thousands of civilians per year within Venezuela. I mean, how likely is it that he's going to be, too excited to work with us to basically help us out in this situation? I don't really know, especially given the historical ties between Venezuela and Russia. Doesn't seem all that likely, but this is one of our last-ditch hopes in terms of, reaching out to the global community to try to get people to release more oil reserves. But if this ends up with Venezuela getting sanctions relief in exchange for something like this, I'm all for it. I mean, if this is what ends up getting the United States to finally take off some of our criminal sanctions on Venezuela, again, I'm all for it. But they continue saying relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have chilled during the Biden administration over American policy in the Gulf region. So this is really interesting because all of the different things that they're about to list right here as reasons for why Saudi Arabia is apparently mad at Joe Biden and the United States are just absolutely insane reasons. So let's just go one by one. They say issues include the revival of the Iran nuclear deal. Okay, so Saudi Arabia just doesn't want us to have a nuclear deal with Iran that under the Obama administration was functioning and was doing its job. I mean, it wasn't a perfect deal, but nonetheless, all of the international agencies that were keeping up with this were saying that Iran was following in perfect accordance with the standards of the deal that we had made. So I guess they just don't want us to have to, or to try to revitalize the Iran nuclear deal after Donald Trump completely tore it up. They also say a lack of U.S. support for the Saudi intervention in Yemen's civil war and its refusal to add the Houthis to its list of terrorist groups. So I covered this on my channel, but just as a reminder, adding the Houthis to the terrorist list internationally would just increase the amount of suffering that is happening within Yemen right now, the single worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. It would make it more difficult for international aid groups to get this desperately needed aid into Yemen, and it would just result in more civilians being casualties of this war. So absolutely insane request there. And again, to suggest that we have not been aiding aiding and abetting this genocide led by Saudi Arabia with their blockade and consistent bombing of Yemen, to pretend as if we have not been aiding and abetting this entire process. We've been selling them weapons, giving them intel support, giving them diplomatic support, etc. So just absolutely insane to suggest that we haven't been complicit in the genocide in Yemen. They also say U.S. help, a lack of U.S. help with a Saudi civilian nuclear program, and legal immunity for Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who had a U.S. Washington Post journalist killed and dismembered. He wants legal immunity. So again, just completely absurd and ridiculous requests that no reasonable person would ever say that we should be doing, especially considering that the whole point of having this Russian oil ban was to have a moral high ground, right? The whole point of banning imports from Russia in oil would be to take a moral stand against what Vladimir Putin is doing. Now, if you're just going to substitute that with Saudi Arabia, then you're not exactly taking a moral stand in any way, shape, or form. And listen, that's not for me to say that any of these other countries that we're going to be appealing to in order to try to get more oil from them, that they're, have perfectly clean hands or anything like that. There is no ethical consumption of oil. That's the point that I'm trying to make, right? There's no ethical consumption of oil. We are essentially dealing with petrostate dictators all around the world. Now, the solution to that in the long term that we're about to get to here in a minute is obviously transitioning towards renewable energies, or in the short term, nationalizing our energy production so that we don't have capitalist enterprises basically deciding artificially to jack up these prices to increase their already inflated profit margins. So that would be my strategy, not going and trying to appeal and reach out to different petrostate dictators. But again, just my take. I think Ilhan Omar had a good take on this. Here's what she had to say. She says here from The Intercept, it's past time we dispense with the fiction that the UAE are a reliable security partner for the United States. And between the allegations of their passing U.S. origin weapons onto terrorist groups in Yemen to their refusal to condemn Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, it is clear time and time again that they do not share our values, our values or our sense of security. Representative Omar, a House Foreign Affairs Committee member, told The Intercept. And she also said the Biden administration should have stopped the Trump F-35 and drone sales on the grounds of human rights and civilian protection in Yemen. But since they did not, I hope this gives them the push that they need to halt that sale immediately. And obviously, she's 100% right. We should not be selling them weapons, period, end of story, okay? This is just a completely ridiculous situation. We're selling weapons to a genocidal regime that is killing civilians with those weapons in Yemen, okay? So you don't have blood on your hands, then don't sell them these fucking weapons and use this as an opportunity to actually put some diplomatic pressure on the Saudis instead of just bending over repeatedly just to get tossed to the side at the end of the day. I mean, the amount that Joe Biden, the amount that Donald Trump and Obama and Bush worked to develop this relationship with the Saudis. I mean, you essentially sold your soul to the devil, not saying that the U.S. is an angel or anything. We are also the devil, but you sold your soul to the devil for cheap oil, and now you have the consequences of the deal with the devil, and you don't even get the cheap oil anymore. So it's like you didn't even from the standards of a U.S. imperialist, you didn't even succeed in your goals or your aims. It's just pathetic that we're still trying to, work on this relationship as if they have, some moral high ground over Russia in oil imports or something. It's just completely ridiculous. Now, we get to the actual solution here, okay? So I think in a couple good threads here by Max Kennerly, he had some good points to be made here about what is actually driving the rise in prices and what could actually be done about it in the immediate and long term. So he says, it would be dysfunctional to promote domestic oil and gas production, and production is at the level chosen by the industry based on market forces. If that's causing harm, we shouldn't subsidize it. We should admit that private oil and gas markets are a failure, and we should nationalize those markets. So this is the weird debate that's been going on around the country right now in terms of what should we do in response to high gas prices, okay? People don't understand that the gas prices are not like a one-to-one correlation between this amorphous blob of global markets and free enterprise capitalism. That's not what's actually happening right now. The reality of the situation is you have capitalist corporations, enterprises within the United States and within Western countries around the world who are price gouging the American people right now in order to pad their bottom lines. That's the reality, okay? So he continues down here saying, bear in mind that domestic oil and gas prices bear no relationship to domestic supply and demand. And the U.S. does not have a shortage of oil or gas. We have a huge excess of natural gas that we export. And we have a bit of an oil oversupply compared to 2000 through 2014, which is winding down. And he says, instead, we have a system in which private oil and gas companies can, for profit, drill on public lands, shift international price movements to the U.S. consumers, and then transfer wealth upwards via dividends and stock buybacks instead of investing in production. Neat trick, huh? And he points out a couple good, graphical pieces and headlines here that put this in perspective. But let's see. So this one was a paragraph from a recent Bloomberg article that just came out a couple days ago. And they say fear is already playing out in the stock market as the war rekindled inflation concerns and clouded the outlook for corporate profits. The S&P 500 energy sector has been one of the few bright spots, continuing its reign as the top performing group in the index, up 35% in 2022. And they say oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips have posted double-digit gains this year, benefiting from a rise in oil prices. So, wow, it's almost like there's a perverse incentive in having a privatized for-profit energy production system. I mean, this is the reality of that. They have a direct incentive to drive up the price of gas right now. That's why gas prices primarily are being driven up. It's not because of some confusing backroom thing that's happening that's just inevitable that we have no control over. It's private corporations who are price gouging people to expand their profits that they can then use on things like stock buybacks and dividends for their shareholders. So they continue. Chevron doubles buyback as spending cap helps lift cash flow. And they say the oil giant to buy back as much as $10 billion a year in stock. And Chevron stock is at a record high on surging crude prices. So again, they are benefiting directly from this. Okay, these are the people who you should actually be blaming primarily for the rise in gas prices. They say Exxon is cutting even more costs. Investor Day comes right after a decision to exit Russia. New savings goal could fund 60% of the oil giant's large dividend. So again, you see what's actually developing here. And he continues, saying Biden is not limiting domestic oil production. It's at 2019 levels because U.S. companies don't want to invest in production. They want to give profits to shareholders. This isn't some big secret or conspiracy theory. It's what shale oil companies have been saying publicly. And this is the case for any fucking capitalist enterprise under this system that we've seen throughout the entirety of this pandemic, especially recently. I mean, we see all of this concern about inflation and labor shortages and all of these different, narratives that are being pushed by corporate America. And then you go and you check the bottom lines of these companies and you see, hang on a second, you're saying that you have to raise prices to make up for supply side costs, but you're also seeing record profits. So if you're seeing record profits, that doesn't mean that it's a one-to-one correlation with supply costs. It means that you are using the narrative of inflation, or in this case, the narrative of rising oil prices due to some, the war in Ukraine or whatever other factors that they want to put into play here, and using that as an excuse to artificially drive up prices more so than you actually would need to do in a moment like this. So he continues saying, on top of that, the oil markets themselves are suggesting to companies that the current prices are temporary, okay? Very important there. And he say people suggesting promote domestic oil and gas production presume that it's being limited by the government. It's not. Production is where our highly profitable markets want it. Don't like that? Then why would you throw more money at it, rewarding all of this and making the incentives worse? If you want controllable oil and gas production that responds to U.S. policy and economic needs rather than short-term profits, fine. Nationalize production and then control it. And he says if you want off this murderer funding, world-destroying fossil fuel merry-go-round, then go green. So again, the answer here, and just to put it one more time in perspective, he asked this good question. Brent crude oil, which is the thing that we're seeing at around like 120, 130, I've seen most recent estimates. Over the past 52 weeks, it's ranged from 60 to 139. And the question is, what is ExxonMobil, just as an example, what is their break-even price after which it's all profit? And you can see here the answer to that. If you go and you look at their charts that they put out in their own, board meetings and shit, you see their break-even price is $41 a barrel. $41 per barrel, as we're seeing prices go up all the way up towards like 130, 140 maybe. I've seen estimates showing it could go all the way up to like 170 or 180. So if your break-even price is $41 per barrel, then explain exactly why we need to be ratcheting up these prices to the levels that they're at right now. The answer to that is you don't need to be ratcheting up the prices right now. So again, the solution at the end of the day, in the immediate sense, if you didn't want to have these massive exploding gas prices here domestically in the US, we don't have a shortage necessarily. What we have are private corporations who are allowed to essentially do whatever the fuck they want with our domestically produced supply or with interacting with the global and international oil markets. If you you wanted to control this, just nationalize these companies. Our entire energy system should not be run by the profit motive. It should be run by the US government, and it should be run on behalf of the American people, so that when times like this come, you don't have to just shovel all of this punishment on working class Americans who are going to have to pay out of their pockets to basically subsidize the profit margins of these capitalist enterprises. It's completely delusional. So again, in the short term, nationalize our energy system. Also in the long term, you should be transitioning as aggressively as possible towards renewable energy, so that we don't have to rely on fossil fuels that are literally destroying the planet.